Hello there, Callum Johns here, and welcome to the EU in Review, where I review expanded universe novels as I read them. Now, today I'm going to be talking about Tales from Jabba's Palace. And I'm going to get straight into it. So the first story, A Boy and His Monster, The Rancor Keeper's Tale, which is written by Kevin J. Anderson. I think this is a great story. It really adds to the emotional weight of the scene in Return of the Jedi with Malakili, and had me really feeling for the Rancor as well as Malakili by the end of the story. And it's interesting how, in a few little points of this, Jawas have very sensitive noses to pick up scents, even scents from emotions, which is really interesting. I'm not sure why, but they say lizard monkey instead of later when they changed in the expanded universe to say monkey lizard. So a Kowakian monkey lizard or a Kowakian lizard monkey. I guess monkey lizard rolls off the tongue a bit more. I think the Rancor scenes are cool. Of course, as I've said previously, I love massacre scenes, and these scenes are pretty awesome. It also mentions the Circus Horrificus, which Malakili was previously on until Jabba bought him, because he's a slave, of course. And the Circus Horrificus is mentioned in Shatterpoint as well, which is part of the Clone Wars multimedia project. Also, I wondered, this is the first mention of Lady Valerian since it's the first novel in the book. Is Lady Valerian a reference to the French comic Valerian et Lorraine? Which, if you don't know, they made a movie called Valerian City of a Thousand Planets, and that's based on the comic Valerian et Lorraine, and that's a science fiction comic, basically. Taster's Choice, The Tale of Jabba's Chef, which is written by Barbara Hambly. I think this is a cool little short story that adds in some different foods, which is always good to have more world building and foods. And the perspective of the chef is interesting. Now the main major point, which is little details, I have with this, is Fairfek is Huttese for a hex or curse. But it's funny how it's also a Mandalorian swear word. So there you go. But yeah, I quite enjoyed the Chef's Tale. I quite enjoyed all these stories, so I'll just keep going through them now. That's Entertainment, The Tale of Salacious Crumb, by Esther M. Freisner. I hope I pronounced these correctly, by the way. So, there's a couple of species that only appear in this story. So the first is the Cow species, and the second is the Markle species, which is different. It'd be good if more of them recurred, but there you go. So a new word I actually encountered in this is physic. Now, I actually thought of physics, which is gravity, friction, all that, But physic is actually a word meaning purging medicine, so it'd be a medicine to make you throw up, which makes sense in this, other than it wouldn't be a medicine in the context it's used in. I thought it was an error. So if anyone has the book, I found it on page 61. Anyway. Also, the story gives credibility to Lady Valerian mentioning other agents in Jabba's palace. So Malakili in the first story meets a bit with Lady Valerian, which is why I mention her name. And she mentions that she has other agents because he offers his services. And here's a bit of a thing. I haven't encountered talking Kowakian monkey lizards before. I'm not sure if I actually like it with Salacious Crumb talking. In a way, just having him give an evil laugh and not talking would be better. Maybe repeating some phrases like a parrot, but not actually talking. So that's something I'm not quite as keen on this story about. But I still did enjoy the story, it was just a bit not as good as some of the others. Now, A Time to Mourn, A Time to Dance, Ulla's Tale by Kathy Tyers. So, I thought it was interesting about the memory wipes. If I find it here, page 85. It should be here, hang on. Yep. You don't understand, 3PO says. Even a partial memory wipe would be disastrous for a droid of my programming. I might have to start from basic initiative body movements. I'm not even certain I would retain my primary communications functions. So that's interesting to note, since he had a memory wipe after episode 3, when he became in the care of Bail Organa. I thought this short story was really compelling. Makes me really feel for the character. It's just the little notes I usually take note of. And yeah, definitely worth a read. Well, this whole book definitely is. So, the next story is Let Us Pray, The Whippet's Tale, by Marina Fitch and Mark Rudds. It gives So overall, this is a cool, different story. It ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, but it gets to that a little bit later. It gives the explanation for the poison thought to be the chef's fault in the chef's tale. So they thought that the chef was poisoning Jabba. So he actually gives the explanation for that properly in this story. And the Whippet also helped with setting up the rescue for Malakili. So if you didn't know, he went to Lady Valerian and they said, okay, we'll rescue you and give you transport off-world. And so this Whippet was part of that. And the Whippet's name is Jaquil, or if I was to try and pronounce it properly, I'd think it's the French origin, so it'd be Jaquil. It's J'Qille. That's the name of the Whippet. It converses with Malakili about the said rescue a bit, which actually isn't mentioned in the earlier story focused on Malakili, which I noticed some of the absence of that. And it sort of fills in the gaps, so maybe whoever's telling the story to whoever's writing it down in universe, or it's an oral tradition, didn't catch that detail. And I like how this story ties in with the same events from a couple of the other stories, which we'll find they do all the way through it. Now, on page 111, I noticed a spelling error. Now let me just find it here. So it's page 111 in mine. I'm not sure if the different prints have different pages. So, it says the whole sentence is even 2 or 3 tended to nurture his pampered paranoia, which I think is supposed to be nurture instead of nurture. Which is interesting, noticing the little details. And there's a whipper called Dwop. Oh, well. The Gamorrean running around carrying the dead bodies he picks up is pretty funny, I reckon. Yeah, that's pretty much the notes on this one. So, the next one is Sleight of Hand, the tale of Mara Jade, written by Timothy Zahn himself, because he's the only one that wrote Mara Jade until Legacy of the Force. Fun fact. Now, overall, I love me some Mara Jade, a great short story, but overall, amongst all the others, it seems to lose something a little bit, because most of the others connect together with each other and the one streamlined storyline, whereas this one doesn't. So that's where I think it just falls a little bit short, with it could have maybe tied in a little bit more with Mara Jade thoughts mentioning some of the other plots or something when it doesn't. But anyway, I can go into this a bit more with some little details I picked up. It's cool to have a man that went out as Jabba, which ties into the original scene in A New Hope, where they had a human as Jabba, the Hutt, instead of the actual Hutt species, which I think it was cut, but then there's a deleted scene with a human going along with that scene with Han, which is where they actually come in when they added the CGI with Han walking over his tail. That was actually him walking behind the human. Of course, the human doesn't have a tail. And so there's another bit that's interesting to me. After Shizor fails to kill Luke, it appears that the Emperor did want him dead, so sicked Mara on his trail. Yet in Return of the Jedi, he talks as if trying to turn Luke. Most likely since the situation presented himself where Luke did offer himself up to Darth Vader. He takes that opportunity, and he wanted a more powerful apprentice than Vader if Luke did turn. Because if you haven't read the Revenge of the Sith novel, the Emperor Darth Sidious laments the loss of a bunch of power because Anakin had his limbs chopped off, and that's losing some power of being able to communicate and use the Force. It also implies Mara forewarned Jabba about Leia being Bush, which is a bounty hunter disguise if you didn't know, which is interesting. Although I don't know if she really needed to, because it seems like in the other stories Jabba's paranoid and has people sleeping with him anyway, and they would have noticed that. Not sleeping with like the non-PG version, they actually sleep around him. Part of it so he's protected more, and part of it so you can keep a watch on any betrayals, which is really cool, I think. So now on to the next story. And then there was The Gamorrean Guard's Tale, written by William F. Wu. It's hilarious. This story is just laughs. I have to love the stupidity of the Gamorrean, which is Gartog. And he takes the body around. He takes them around as they rot, and he just keeps carrying them. I find that pretty funny. And some of the descriptions. 148. I may as well find the pages here. Some of the descriptions are hilarious. So, I'll read it out to you. One of these was a standout. Gartog saw that one of the corpse's eyeballs had started to ooze out of his head. That was bad. He might need the evidence for the crime. Snorting in annoyance, Gartog poked the eye back in with a thick, stubby forefinger. Some of that just casual, fun stuff is hilarious. But there's a bit of a revelation about Gartog in under the later story, so I'll leave to talk about there. It was just a really good laugh, this story. Although by the end I kind of feel sorry for Gartog because he gets bullied because of his seeming stupidity. And yeah. So the next story is Old Friends, Effant Mon's Tale by Kenneth C. Flint. So alluding to a story back with a younger, more physically capable Jabba was interesting. I would like to see a story about that, which I haven't seen yet at all. And this story is a good one. The story of Effant Mon is a fascinating one to me. Sort of a person who went out to find an adventure and then realised that he's gone off track and needs to go back and do something. Get his life back on track, basically, with what he really likes. The stories he tells in his own head mostly, because it's a lot of these are thoughts inside the characters' heads. are great, and the character development I think is quite well done for a short story. It's like all of these, I think, really. The character development's done quite well. Although that would go back to Sleight of Hand not being quite as good amongst these other stories, because it's Mara Jade. She hasn't changed much by the end other than she failed, and we don't see the outcome of that really. So, the next one is Goatgrass, the tale of Ree-Yees. Sounds like yeet. Ree-Yees anyway, the Gram. It's written by Deborah Wheeler. A different swear word substitute that came up I wasn't aware of is crotting. It's on page 179 if anyone wants to have a look. Tessex's S's are drawn out in his dialogue in this story, where Tessek appeared in a couple of others and they aren't. So he also uses a speaking apparatus in this story when he doesn't in the others. It's also interesting how Ree-Yees lies about where he found the body, most likely to try and get back at Effort Mon, because they started a bit of a rivalry in Effort Mon's story. There's also possibly a James Bond reference, saying stirred, not shaken, with it's basically a martini. It's on page 187 if anyone's wondering. Also, he says that R2 mixed the drinks on the sail barge. From the movie, I only knew that R2-D2 was serving the drinks. I didn't know he actually mixed them. So that's interesting that they actually programmed the serving droids to mix drinks. So this story was cool. I'm confused though. He has visions throughout it. I don't know why he receives visions. So that's something that maybe could be answered in an extra short story somewhere. Now, and the band played on The Band's Tale by John Gregory Betancourt. I hope I pronounced these right. Betancourt, not Betancourt. So, Droopy McCall's name origin is funny. It's pretty much just, let's give you a cool stage name, Droopy McCall. Also, some bits ambush them. So at the start there's someone else actually in charge of the band, and they get their gear picked up by Biths, but then the Biths ambush them because they don't want another band taking the gig. Are these Biths the modal nodes from A New Hope? And do they want to keep the gig at Chalmun's Cantina so that they get the money and whatnot? That's interesting to think about anyway. I didn't know Ortolan's obsessed about food before, so I thought that was interesting. And I wonder about the multiple tellings of Jabba's death scene. Ree-Yees was apparently in the room when he died, and it has a whole bit about that. Was he in the room? I didn't notice in the movie, but maybe he was out of the shot. So yeah, I think this is a cool story about the band, and it's interesting to hear about how the band came to be. And it's not the special edition band, it's the original theatrical version band, so it doesn't have the extra guy who sings Jedi rock. Now, the next one is Of the Day's Annoyance, Bib Fortuna's Tale by M. Shane. It didn't give the full name, so I'm just doing what it said in the book. I reckon Nat Secura must be a relation to Ayla Secura. If you've read it, you'll know who I'm talking about with Nat Secura. It also says Bib Fortuna was the first to sell real spice, which is basically drugs if you don't know what spice is, from Ryloth. How old is he if this is true? Or is it that he thinks he's the first? Because the Clone Wars happened around then. I don't know if real would have been actually sold from Ryloth before then, because Ryloth appears from this story was fairly isolated before the Clone Wars, when the Clone Wars TV series doesn't have it, but TV series conflicts a bit anyway, and that sort of thing. Bib Fortuna meeting Luke first is interesting, because it's a preparation to meet Jabba, and I didn't think of it before, that Luke might have to go through a security wall to get to Jabba, more than just walking into the palace. Luke calls the Alliance the Rebellion. What I find interesting about this is usually people that are part of the Rebellion call the Rebellion the Alliance to restore the Republic. So, the Rebel Alliance, basically. And they just call it the Alliance. Now, Fortuna learns this intuition from the Bomar monks. Could it be the Force? Possibly. And I think later on they build on that. They build on that with the story. The addition of the thermal detonator on the barge has the explosion make a bit more sense, I think. Because there's a huge explosion from the blasters going. Yeah. I think the ending is melancholic. And you can read it to find out. It's an interesting story and a great addition to expanding Bib Fortuna's character, I reckon, as a conclusion to that. And so I had to turn a light on. The Great God Quay, The Tale of Barada and the Weequays by George Alec Effinger. I think it's cool to have the Anzati mentioned. I only remember one being in Galaxy of Fear previously in the novels, which I think is cool to bring them more into this. The explanations around the Weequay are cool. The reason for their silence and their god, as we call them, as they call it. Them finding the thermal detonator reverts to an earlier comment about the size of the sail barge's explosion. So that actually removed the thermal detonator from the sail barge, which sort of gets rid of the extra explanation for a large explosion. So I guess the fuel tanks just get blasted by the deck blaster. What a design for the sail barge, eh? This is another cool story that's the Weequay one. Now, A Bad Feeling, The Tale of EV-99. Written by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. Now this one, I think, I don't know why I'm so drawn to them, but I'm really drawn to the stories about droids gaining more sentience and about what they do, like the IG-88 story in Tales of Bounty Hunters. This is a really cool story. I loved reading about the way that EV-99 and the way her story went. And yes, EV-99 is referred to as a she and a her. Feminine pronouns. So EV-99, which, if you don't know, is the torture droid in Return of the Jedi. Technically, she would be the first feminine programmed, I'll say, droid. Because I don't think droids have genders. Now, I think the Lando intro into this is really cool. More Lando is always good. And the Gonk scream makes more sense now. So, EV-99 was torturing the Gonk droid in Return of the Jedi. Now, in this novel, it actually says it's a wide-spectrum multiband signal for assistance. Which actually makes more sense, as if you're hurt, you'd have a programmed response to send a signal for assistance. And also they have pain simulator buttons. They help explain why it responds to the stimulus of pain that way. I think it's cool how the setup for the two droids in the palace, so R2-D2 and C-3PO, it goes more into depth about how they got into the palace, which is awesome. And I like the explanation they say about putting restraining bolts on the droids. They were reconfigured, and EV99 even says that she's reconfigured herself to say that the restraining bolt won't work because they rewired them, which is cool. And now for A Free Quarren in the Palace. Tessek's Tale, written by Dave Wolverton. It seems like Tessek got into Jabba's palace before Bib Fortuna, so this is going near the end of the story itself with my notes, because most of it was not little details that were noteworthy as far as I go, but it's still a great story, I think. So Bib Fortuna gets back to the palace after the sail barge is destroyed to find the Boma monks have taken over. Tessek seems to get there earlier because more people are around and the Boma monks haven't taken over completely. But I wouldn't think they're far apart from each other, seeing as they both caught skiffs to go back to Jabba's palace. So, the monks probably only just established their hold on the palace after Bib Fortuna got there. It's interesting that Tessek developed the powers he got, like seeing different places, projecting plots, all those powers. He got that after... spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Skip ahead a little bit if you don't want to hear it. He got his brain put into the jars like the Boma monks, into a brain walker as they've been calling them in this story. And he develops the powers as that. And it must be connected to the Force and its potential in all living beings. I think the story is interesting, and I think all of the stories just add another dimension to Return of the Jedi, which I'm really keen to watch after reading this again. Now, Tongue-Tied, Bubo's Tale by Daryl F. Mallet. Now, I didn't know who this was, but here we go. It's interesting how Bubo willingly gets his brain put into the jar compared to the others who were forced in the previous tales. I'm going backwards now. The monks use telepathy, which must also be an application of the Force. I don't know what species this character is supposed to be. Bubocula, it seems like his name is said, the full name. Because it seems like basically a frog with two eye stalks is an intelligent being. Anyway, I'm not sure why it doesn't have a picture under the title like the others, so I'll see if I can find. So yeah, like this one, it has a picture under the title, and this one doesn't, as well as a couple of others I'll get to later. Now, Out of the Closet. Oh, nah. The Assassin's Tale by Jennifer Robertson. I think it's interesting how this is a whole story featured on the Ananzati's mind. Now, it's interesting insight into the mind of an Ananzati. And he actually is Danik Jericho, which is referenced in previous stories. And this is where Gartog is redeemed. Gartog in his stupidity went, "Oh, he's a snot vampire. Hold my nose," as he walks past. Pretty funny moment, right? And then at the end he's going, "I worked out who the killer was. It must be Danik Jericho." In his seeming stupidity, he worked out the right answer. And that's why I feel even worse for him afterwards, and that no one will listen to him. Now, I don't know what an Anzati's life expectancy is. It seems to be unlimited. He says he's 1,010 years old in this story. Now, this story has a different feel to it to the others. It's in first person, but it's also partially broken English in some sentences, so it's a bit different because it's from his point of view, of course. But it's cool, and the only insight into an Anzati that I've read so far. Yeah. The next one is Shara and the Sarlacc, the Skiffsguard's Tale by, how do I say this? Daniel Danahy Oakes, seems to be correct. This one also doesn't have a picture under the title, even though they could just put one of the Weequay guards under it. And pretty much this is a cool story that leads into the next one, which it's an interesting short personal story by the Skiffguard talking to Boba Fett. And the next one is one of them. I'd say it's the most important of the stories, but I wouldn't say it's one of the best ones. They're all pretty good. So it's Above Like That, The Tale of Boba Fett by J.D. Montgomery. Now this one, I'll just go through my points and then say at the end. Slave One has a maintenance droid, which I guess with so many credits made, it's a worthwhile investment. But then it also could be someone hacks his maintenance droid and causes problems. And who knows? It's cool to have the dogfight over Tatooine with IG-88 from Boba Fett's perspective, because before in Tales of the Bounty Hunter they gave IG-88's perspective. And now they give Boba Fett's perspective, which is cool. Boba Fett flies normally with the inertial dampeners off. So, if you don't know what inertial dampeners are, it's self-explanatory in the name pretty much, but he actually stops you from all the G-force from flying. Yeah. Here's a bit of a continuity thing. It says Boba wasn't raised speaking basic, but as of Attack of the Clones, you know, he speaks basic fine there. Basic is English if you don't know. And don't know. They say that's why he sounds harsh when he's speaking, because he doesn't have much experience with it. But yeah, that's just an interesting note. It's also interesting how there's a bit of a duplicity between Susejo and the Sarlacc. Like it's a keeper of the Sarlacc and can control it to a point. When later in the story it actually reveals why it's like that, but I'll leave that for you to read. The stories of previous victims are told to Boba Fett because this is a story about Boba Fett once he's fallen into the Sarlacc pit and how he gets out. Now, they mix up the story a bit by telling stories of previous victims. This reinforces the story and Tales of the Bounty Hunters with Boba Fett by saying that he still has mixed memories from that time, from the soup of the Sarlacc pit. And I love how it does lead into the story of the Jedi. So he mentions earlier that there's a Jedi that fell into the Sarlacc pit, and I thought, oh, that might just be a mention that they don't cover, but they actually cover it instead of just referencing it, which I thought was really cool. And I think there's a noteworthy philosophy that's interesting on page 356, which is here. So this says, you and I and everything else, we are merely a process, Boba Fett. A process that has named itself I. Surely the real exists and we are an expression of it. But are you and I real? No. We are processes that have grown arrogant and broken apart from the real. In time we shall be rejoined to it. The voice paused. You want to know why this is taking so long? You've barely been down here a day. There are sentients who've been kept alive for hundreds of years while the Sarlacc digested them. That's pretty much the end of that. But yeah, I find it interesting how it has the philosophy that we're not really real. We've broken off from what is real to be individual. It's an interesting viewpoint. And I think It's an awesome story, this one. It's how Boba Fett escapes the Sarlacc pit and lives on. Spoilers. But if you've read anything post Return of the Jedi or played Jedi Academy or some other games, you would know that. It makes sense how he survives, to me, because it's a quite unique situation with the jetpack and everything. I'm not sure how it changes his genetics though, as the Tales of the Bounty Hunter story says. Because it says it changes his genetics so he can't have children. Still not sure how that happens, but the story is brilliant and well deserved for Boba Fett to make him a badass. And now the last story. Skin Deep, The Fat Dancer's Tale by A.C. Crispin. This doesn't have a photo under the title either. Just a little note. The extra bit with Tessek is cool. It isn't in his other story and it helps it make more sense. Which, it's her interacting with Tessek a little bit. The size of her being water retention, so they say she's fat and ugly and whatever, but it actually delves into some of those social justice issues a bit. It says it's actually about water retention for her species. So, because it's a desert planet, she needs to retain more water, and so she's bigger. And it makes sense to me. It does get deep into themes of bullying people who are different, like the fat and ugly and whatnot. In it, she makes friends with someone, and it's after Jabba's death, and they going over to Mos Eisley with obstacles along the way. A blast setting for cutting is a good idea, so they change the blaster setting from explosion to cutting tool sort of one. And it goes through the internal organs of the crate dragon, which, as I have a bit of interest in animals, it's interesting. And just for this story, wow. It was just a background character that has been given so much depth, and I love it. A.C. Crispin has really been brilliant with this story, and it's like the Han Solo trilogy. If you haven't read it, do. She's a great writer, and it gives characters so much more depth. And I didn't even remember this character properly from Return of the Jedi, and yet she's given so much depth. It's brilliant. And then it goes into a bit of an epilogue where it actually tells us what happens to everyone after the events in the stories, which are really good. So in conclusion, these are brilliant stories that really add a lot of depth to the simple short space of time they take place in. I love them. I love how it connects one singular plot line through most of the stories, and how it ties everything together, and it's really profound. As far as I really want to watch Return of the Jedi again, as if I pick up anything, because this is what the expanded universe is about. It really never ceases to amaze me how it can give an entirely new perspective on something I've watched a lot, like Return of the Jedi. And I think Salacious Crumb story might be my least favourite. And to be honest, I can't really pick a favourite, but if I had to choose, I think I would say the story of Yana, which is the Fat Dancer's Tale. Because I never even expected it to go that far into that, and it's awesome. So that's my thoughts on Tales from Jabba's Palace. And I hope you liked it. Any questions, just comment and I'll answer as best I can. I'll see you in the next video.